Hi everyone, it's Miss Simmons again. I wanted to talk to you about units 1 through 3 government. So hopefully you guys can see up at the top there that it says government or government right here. I'm not going to talk about each one of these things, but I wanted to highlight some major differences, especially between the Spanish, the British, and the French colonial system government-wise. So again, remember units 1 goes from 1492 to 1607, unit 2 goes from 1607 to 1754, and unit 3 is 1754 to 1800. In this time period, the first unit, you're going to see the Spanish and the French establishing their colonies. In the identity video, I talked about the mission system. We're going to see, as part of the government aspect of what's happening, the Spanish really competing with the Portuguese for control over the Americas. One example of that might be the Treaty de Tordesillas that they're establishing. Spain manages to get most of the Americas, and they establish something called New Spain. It's a very organized empire where they have specific people in control of different parts. They have a mission system where they're trying to convert people to Christianity. And because they are so successful in their economy and establishing their government, you're seeing a lot of competition from other European countries who also want to make as much money as the Spanish are going to. And so, specifically, you're going to start to see that competition lead to battles between different countries. In 1588, you have the Spanish battling the British in the Battle of the Spanish Armada, where the British will ultimately win that. The British are going to be also establishing in the 1580s the first unsuccessful colony in Roanoke, which is in North Carolina, and then successfully establishing Jamestown in 1607. You have the government of Native Americans we talked about at the beginning of the year, the Iroquois Confederacy. The Native Americans, depending on the group, all have very different types of governments. The Iroquois have that confederacy between the 5 different tribes of the Iroquois. And you're going to see other confederacies in Native American groups as well. The Iroquois Confederacy is the most famous, but most every Native American group had a separate system of government. You have Native Americans resisting the establishment of governments and the establishment of European colonies. That's kind of a consistent theme throughout all of these particular units. And one of the things that is true of the British government in the colonial system is that each colony will have its own separate system of government, as well as having to listen to the crown. So, for instance, you have the House of Burgesses established in 1619 in the Virginia colony. The Puritans have the Mayflower Compact, which allows them to have some form of self-government as well as trying to listen to the crown. And so that's something that's a unique hallmark of the British colonial system, where you have individual governments as well as having to listen to what Great Britain wanted. But Great Britain gave some autonomy to each of these colonies to be able to have some form of self-rule government-wise. When the British feel like they are not being represented following the French and Indian War, that's when that lead up to the American Revolution happened. And that's going to be really happening in Unit 3. So, Unit 3, government-wise, following the French and Indian War, you have this pushback against the British government because the belief is that Parliament is not representing the colonist and not representing their particular interest. You see a lot of examples of how they're resisting the British colonial system. You have committees of correspondence where you have colonies communicating with each other about how they're going to resist. You see the Sons of Liberty being formed, which is more of a direct rebellion action following in several of the colonies. And one of the things that's going to happen is a resistance to British colonial crackdown after the French and Indian War will be the Boston Tea Party, which leads ultimately in 1774 to the Intolerable Acts. The Intolerable Acts are really focused on Massachusetts and Boston in particular. The Intolerable Acts are a punishment for that Boston Tea Party. So they force Massachusetts and Boston in particular to pay for all the destroyed tea. They force the people who who are put on trial to have their trial back in Great Britain. It gets rid of the colonial government in Massachusetts and imposes a British form of government specifically in Massachusetts. And it also establishes the Quartering Act for the establishing that more and more British soldiers are going to be in Massachusetts to enforce those intolerable acts. Those intolerable acts lead to resistance across all of the colonies, and ultimately it's one of the biggest steps that brings us to the American Revolution. Common Sense in 1776. That's published in early 1776, I believe January of 1776. That's the first time we're seeing a mass publication that indicates that all of the colonies should be working toward independence, not just trying to get representation in parliament, but actually becoming an independent country. That helps lead to the very first Continental Congress, which comes up with the idea of writing the Declaration of Independence. The Second Continental Congress is going to be the thing that's in charge during the American Revolution. The American Revolution will take place from 1776 to 1783. And during that time period, that Second Continental Congress is going to establish our very first form of government as an independent country, and that's the Articles of Confederation. Remember that the Articles of Confederation gave very little power to the central government, and most power went specifically to the states because of a fear of some sort of tyrannical government. The Articles of Confederation limited the powers of the federal government, whereas when that really fails, when our economy is failing, when our system of government is not able to put down rebellions that it sees, for instance, Shays Rebellion in Massachusetts, then that will lead ultimately to the Constitutional Convention of 1787. And that Constitutional Convention will ultimately lead to the writing and scrapping of the Articles of Confederation, writing the Constitution. The Constitution is going to be ratified in 1789. That new constitution is going to give a lot more broad powers to the federal government, but retain some powers to the states. So we have that balance. We also have checks and balances of government being established. During this early republic period, under George Washington's presidency, as he chooses his first cabinet, he chooses specifically for the Secretary of the Treasury to be Hamilton and his first Secretary of State to be Jefferson. Those two men have very different political views on how the government should be run. Hamilton wants more power to the central government. Hamilton wants to create a national bank. Hamilton wants the capital to be kept in New York, where it's more connected to business. And Hamilton envisions a future of the United States that is partially agrarian, meaning agricultural, but for the most part is focused on developing industry and business. And he thinks that the government should play a role in establishing and supporting the notion of new businesses being set up. Jefferson, on the other hand, has this future vision of the United States as being an agrarian republic where you have a lot of yeoman farmers who are educated people who can vote, but they own land and they're farmers and they're not heavily invested in business. These two men's ideas are going to be in conflict, and that helps to lead to the formation of our very first two political parties. Hamilton's party is the Federalist Party. Jefferson's party is the Democratic Republican Party. George Washington will serve 2 terms as president, and when he chooses to leave and not serve a 3rd term, which he could have, he has Hamilton draft his farewell address in which he espouses some major ideas that he supports. And one of those major ideas is that political parties actually serve to divide the nation and that they're not vehicles that help us. They just serve to divide us. And he does not support political parties. Another part of George Washington's farewell address is this notion that we should not get involved in entangling alliances with other countries. That's where I'm going to leave off there. By the way, if you were watching Identity, I couldn't see one of the blocks, and it was about Republican motherhood. And that actually ties back to the notion of government, because Republican motherhood is the notion that even women have a role in this new republic. The role is to raise virtuous citizens who are going to vote and take part in a republic. This is the first republic the world has seen since the times of ancient Greece. Hope this finds you well. Bye-bye.